Make sure I get to the top of my presentation here. All right, welcome everyone to our webinar today. So our webinar today is to how to better plan and review your sprints. And then specifically for this session, what I'm going to be doing is going over the sprint planning and sprint review events in Scrum. Right. Let me first introduce myself very quickly. My name is Richard Cheng. I'm an Agile trainer and coach by background, and I lead the training unit here at NextUp Solutions. I have a series of certifications, which allows me to teach a lot of our wonderful courses. I am based here in Reston, Virginia. By the way, in the chat window, if you like, feel free to type in what city and state you are zooming in from. So for me, I am zooming in from Reston, Virginia, and we can see who wins the award for closest to me as well as furthest from me. We have Florida in the house. Florida right now wins for furthest from me so far. Oh no, Seattle, Washington, I think is furthest from me. Maybe, oh, this is an expose how bad I am. Nope, it's not. I was about to say this is an expose how bad I am at geography, but I think Renata, am I pronouncing that correctly? We have a visitor from Innsbruck, Austria. That's awesome. Thank you from Innsbruck. A visitor from London, England. That's awesome as well. So welcome to all everyone here in the US. Welcome to my Canadian colleague as well. Welcome to the Austrians and your Londoners in the house too. Another one from the UK. Welcome, Femi. Awesome. A lot of my background. Oh, Nigeria. Welcome, Didi from Nigeria. That's great. So we have at least 3 continents represented. That's fantastic. A lot of my background is in commercial, nonprofit, and association work. And the concepts we're going to talk about in this class span all those domains. Not this class. Concept in this webinar will span all those domains. Let me give everyone my contact information. I'm going to copy and paste this and put this in the chat. Feel free to join me on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. Feel free to join our company, NextUp Solutions, on both LinkedIn and Twitter. That very last link is a link to my calendar. If anyone ever wants to set up a meeting with me to chat with me one-on-one, feel free to set up time to chat with me one-on-one. By the way, if anyone wants to share their LinkedIn information in the chat and have people link in with you, feel free to do so. You don't have to do that if you don't want, but if you want to share your LinkedIn or your Twitter or whatever social that you want to promote, feel free to put that in the chat as well. Speaking of promotions, a couple of quick shout outs. We do offer a whole slew of training classes. This includes our a lot of Scrum Alliance pieces, Certified ScrumMaster, Certified Scrum Product Owner, Certified Scrum Developer, the more advanced versions of that course, Agile Leadership, are all classes we offer. We offer Kanban classes. We offer scaled Agile courses as well.
I am returning your phone call. This is Linda Lee about the health.
Mike. There we go. Thank you. We offer a whole slew of IC Agile classes, including Agile testing, test automation, facilitation, and DevOps. Reach out to us for any of your training needs. We also offer coaching solutions. We provide Scrum Masters, Agile coaches. We do assessments, leadership coaching, leadership training. If you have any coaching needs, feel free to reach out to us as well. And we have a software development center in both Blacksburg, Virginia. We partner with Virginia Tech down there, as well as in Raleigh, North Carolina. We partner with NC State over there for our software development shops. And so feel free to reach out to us if you have software development needs as well. And now with that said, let's jump into the topic. So let's talk about sprint planning first. So if you look at the Scrum big picture here, this kind of shows the overall concept around Scrum. We have the product goal / vision at the top, the roadmap layer, the release layers, and the sprint layers. And in the sprint layers, sprint planning is that very first event that gets us ready for the sprint, right? The sprint planning is that very first event that gets us ready for the sprint. So let me show you a calendar. This calendar is very typical of a 2-week cycle. By the way, for those of you doing Scrum, in the chat, type in how long your sprints are. For example, most of the teams I worked in the past tend to focus on 2-week sprints, right? Whoops, 2-week sprints. But the guidance is anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. So in the chat window, type in how long your sprints are. Okay, great. A lot of 2-week sprint folks, which is great. Some 3-week sprints. Yeah. Scrum guidance is anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. 2 weeks I've found a lot of teams use, which is great. So what you see here in this chart is a 2-week calendar. So what we're going to do here is we do sprint planning. Let's say in this example, Monday, April 1st. You're welcome to do sprint planning any day of the week you want, but I do have a couple recommendations. I actually like Wednesday a lot for sprint planning, although you're welcome to do it any day of the week you want. But I do recommend trying to avoid Monday and Friday as major meeting days, including sprint planning. The reason is this. When people are out of office or take vacation, it tends to involve a Monday or Friday. When we have holidays, they often involve a Monday or Friday. And in some organizations, I've seen alternative work schedules where they work extra a bit and they have like every other Friday off, for example. And so I recommend trying to avoid Monday and Fridays as my major meeting days and try to target Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday as my meetings. So sprint planning in this example, we're doing Wednesday, April 1st. Sprint planning for a 2-week sprint takes no more than about 4 hours at most. So in this example here, what you would do is start off your day with sprint planning in this example, and then the second half of the day would be the official start of my sprint. Then what I would have is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 full days of my sprint. And then here on Tuesday, April 14th, the first half of the day, it would be still part of my sprint. And the second half of the day, I would do my sprint review, invite my end users, customers, stakeholders in to show them what we built so far, have them interact with it, get their feedback, no more than 2 hours for a 2-week sprint. And then in a separate session after that, product owner, Scrum Master, and developers get together for the retro. And the next day is the very start of my next sprint. And I repeat that cycle. Quick note with these sprints, I like doing it as a repeated cycle. Sprint planning, in this example, every other Wednesday, review and retro every other Tuesday. The reason why I like it as a repeated cycle is that way my teams can put it in their calendars and they can plan their schedules knowing that this is our repeated pattern. Also, if or when we ever go back to the office, if your office is like every office I've been to in the world, conference room scheduling can be a bit of a hassle. And by putting it as a recurring event in a conference room, I have greater stability in my meeting space, knowing that I have this recurring. Right? So I like this as a repeated pattern. Any questions so far about my sprint schedule? So then in sprint planning, let's say we do it Wednesday, April 1st. So what happens in sprint planning, there's essentially 3 things we have to go over in sprint planning. The first one is, why is a sprint valuable? This results in our sprint goal. The next, we identify what could be done in the sprint. That determines the scope of the sprint. And finally, how will the chosen work get done? And that often results in tasks that we put in the product backlog. Tasks. We basically break down the product backlog items into a series of smaller, more executable tasks. So that's typically what we cover in sprint planning. Right now, with that said, the way the mechanics work is. Hey there. I'm getting a hot mic.
I have an appointment this afternoon.
So I'm going to mute all.
And
I was very curious to see what the outcome of that appointment was, but I muted everyone so that we lost the hot mics. So in sprint planning, what we have here in sprint planning, by default, it's the product owner, the developers, and the Scrum Master, right? And the way sprint planning works, the mechanics of it, the way I usually do it is I usually do it in 2 parts. So the first part of sprint planning will be the product owner will lead most of the first part of sprint planning. And so what we would start off by saying is, welcome team to our sprint planning today. For this sprint, we're tentatively going to target this goal. As an example, we're going to enable the shopping cart capabilities on our e-commerce platform. That's the goal for this sprint. Great. Enable shopping cart capabilities for our e-commerce website. That's the goal for this sprint. And to support that goal, as a product owner, I would have come in with the product backlog already well refined. And I would say, to support that goal, here are the highest priority user stories. For this user story number 1 is as follows. I'll read off the user story, read off the acceptance criteria. I would say, hey team, any questions I can help with? The team may ask us for some clarifying questions. And at this point, now you don't have to do it this way, but this is a general pattern I like, is I'll even say, all right, let's do some planning poker to figure out how big this is. 1, 2, 3, show, 5, 8, 5, 8, 5, 8. This one's 8-pointer. Great. Move on. Here's the second highest priority item. I'll read off the user story, explain why it's important, help answer any clarifying questions, do some estimates. This one is a 5-pointer. We'll do the next one, 3-pointer. Next one, 8-pointer. Next one, 5-pointer. Next one, 8-pointer. Next one, 2-pointer. And so we keep on doing this. At some point, the team say, okay, we're full. Right? And once the team says we're full, what we'll do is we'll look at what we brought in so far. And what I like to do as a sanity check is we'll summarize the total number of story points. And let's say what we brought into this sprint, let's say the total adds up to be, let's say 65 story points. Okay. So then with the 65 story points, I would take this and look at that compared to what we've done historically. Meaning this, let's say we're bringing in 65 story points, but let's say my team is averaging 50 story points and we've never finished more than 60. I would say, hey team, we brought in 65 story points. We brought in 65 story points, but historically we're averaging about 50. We've never finished more than 60. Do we need to pull some out, right? So we'll have that conversation. Similarly, let's say that my team is averaging 80 story points, but there's only 65 here. We would say, hey team, we're averaging 80 story points, but there's only 65 in here. Do we want to add some more in? You don't have to pull things out. You don't have to add more things in, but we just have that conversation as a quick sanity check to make sure that this is sensible. The other thing I like doing as well is I like having a calendar up and visible. And in the calendar, what we'll do is we'll mark off any major constraints. Let's say, for example, someone's on vacation for a few days. We might have a couple of team members on vacation, or let's say we have that Labor Day holiday on Monday. So we say Labor Day on Monday, or I have team members in training for 2 days. So we'll just mark this off in calendar to see if there's any constraints, right? So in the first part of sprint planning, we talk about that. Basically, we kind of had an initial discussion around sprint goal, and we had initial discussion on what could be done in the sprint. That's the first part of sprint planning. And now in the second part of sprint planning, the product owner takes a bit of a back seat and the developers take over. And what they will do is they'll take each one of these items we brought into the sprint. Let's say, for example, we brought in 9 items into the sprint, and they'll break these down to a series of smaller, more executable tasks. They'll break these down to a series of smaller, more executable tasks. So what that means then is the output of sprint planning is a sprint backlog, which is often visualized via a visual task board. So when you look at this task board here, here's what this is saying. This first user story, it has 3 tasks associated with it, and it's the highest priority user story in the sprint. Second user story has 2 tasks associated with it. It's the second highest priority item in the sprint. Third user story has 5 tasks associated with it. It's the third highest priority user story in the sprint. And if you had more, they would just be further down. So in this sample task board, is a visual representation of my sprint backlog, which is my team's plan for the sprint. Any questions about sprint planning so far? Okay, I have some questions for you that we're going to work through together. Question number 1, what is the input to sprint planning? In the chat window, type in the answer. Question number 1, what is the input to sprint planning? In the chat window, type in the answer. Ah, there you go, Jim. Very nice. So Jim has the correct answer. The input to sprint planning is indeed the product backlog. The product backlog is the input to sprint planning. Good, nice. Yep, and I like the nuance that some of you put, like Jim and Femi, the refined product backlog. Yes, so input to sprint planning is the product backlog. Very nicely done. Good. Question number 2, what is the output to sprint planning? What is the output to sprint planning? Ah, good job, Alice. Good job, Kira. Output to sprint planning, like Kira and Alice pointed out, is indeed the sprint backlog. It is indeed a sprint backlog. And by sprint backlog, what that means, it's all the items brought into the sprint, along with the task for those items, wrapped around the sprint goal. That combined is a sprint backlog. Good. Question number 3. For a 2-week sprint, how long is sprint planning supposed to be? For a 2-week sprint, how long is sprint planning supposed to be? Very nice. Yeah, Alice is getting gold star so far. 4 hours is correct. In sprint planning, what Scrum recommends is roughly about the max of 2 hours per week of sprint duration. I just typed this into the chat. What that means is for a 2-week sprint, it'd be no more than 4 hours at most. For a 2-week sprint, no more than 2 hours at most. For a 4-week sprint, it'd be no more than 8 hours at most, which is one of the reasons why I don't love 4-week sprints. 8 hours can be a bit of a painful meeting.
Richard, quick one here. I've had conversations where it says that those 8 hours don't have to be prorated. It's whatever works for the team, because it looks like we're prorating it here.
Well, that's the general guidance. And the point here, is that Femi talking?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, welcome, Femi. Good seeing you, or good hearing from you. So what the guidance is going to be no more than that. Now, with that said, your team can find their own norms, but what you're going to be looking for is if you're going past that time box, something's probably wrong, right? So if I'm doing 2-week sprints and I'm going past 4 hours regularly, there's something that we're doing that we may want to tweak and adjust. So it's kind of a guidance to a max time box, but Femi, your team can kind of tweak that based on their specific needs. But I would suggest though, that if you're going past the max allocated time, something might be going on that you may want to adjust or tweak. Does that help with your question, Femi?
Yes, it does, Richard. Thank you.
You're welcome. Question number 4. Who is in the sprint planning meeting? Who is in the sprint planning meeting? In the chat window, type in who is in the sprint planning meeting. Developers, Scrum Master, Product Owner is correct. Awesome answers. Sharp folks in the room. Developer, Product Owner, Scrum Master is correct. Now, with that said, bonus question. Would it not make sense to maybe have some of the developers in sprint planning and others doing other stuff? Or do I want all my developers there? What do you think? Can I have some of my developers in sprint planning and others can be doing other work? Or do I want all my developers there? What do you think? In the chat window, type in what you think. Yeah, I really want them all. And there's a few reasons for this. One is I want them all to hear the same messaging, right? 2, I want them all to be able to ask their questions and give their thoughts and their opinions. And we really want, there's a big difference between I want my team to be able to work smart and hard at the same time, right? Also, logistically, when you think about it, the last sprint's ended. Next sprint hasn't started yet. So in theory, what are they working on? So I do want all my developers there because I want them all to hear the same message, to give their recommendations and advice, provide their estimates. I want them all to be part of that process. Good answers. Number 5, what is the product owner doing during sprint planning? What is the product owner doing during sprint planning? Type your answer in the chat window. And this one, I will tell you right now, it's a bit of a tricky question. It's a bit of a tricky question. Well, Jim, I see what you're getting at. They will be doing a few things. I like what the Jim and Alice are saying here. Yes. All right, so this one right here, here's where it's tricky, because here's the correct answer. The correct answer is explaining the sprint goal, right? It's explaining the highest priority product backlog items / user stories. And it's answering questions. So I just type this in the chat. That's what the product owner is doing during sprint planning. Now, the reason why this is a tricky question, because here's what the product owner is not doing during sprint planning. They are not writing the PBIs. They are not writing the acceptance criteria. They are not prioritizing, right? Now, why are they not writing acceptance criteria, writing user stories, or prioritizing? Where does writing the acceptance criteria, writing the user stories, and prioritizing, where does that actually happen? Because that does not happen in sprint planning. Where does that actually happen? Refinement is correct. So in refinement, so this one here, the product owner is kind of helping helping finalize the sprint goal, presenting the highest priority items, answering questions is correct. And refinement is where we write user stories, write acceptance criteria, and prioritize. That's all part of refinement. Very nicely done. This is a super sharp group. Number 6, can we have non-Scrum team members attend sprint planning? Can we have non-Scrum team members attend sprint planning? What do you folks think? In the chat window, type in what you think. So I get a yes from Femi. Good. Why not? As long as they don't interrupt. Sure, listen. Yeah. So here's what I would say about this. By default, when I do sprint planning, it's more of a working level meeting. We would have generally talked to a lot of stakeholders prior to sprint planning to bring in their needs. So by default, it's generally going to be product owner, developers, Scrum Master by default. Now, with that said, I would say this. I would say that if you want to invite a stakeholder or subject matter expert that makes a meeting better and more effective, I think that's great. I'll give you an example. So let's say, so Femi is the first one to answer here. So let's say Femi in this example is one of my key stakeholders. Femi is a stakeholder on the business side. And let's say for this sprint, we're doing a lot of work in Femi's area. So here's what I might do. If I'm the product owner, I might approach Femi and say, hey, Femi, we're doing sprint planning tomorrow. We're going to do a lot of work in your area for this sprint. Can you sit in sprint planning with us? That way, if a team has questions, you can help me answer their questions. You kind of hear some of their questions that they're asking and provide more insights. We'll even do your stuff first. So as soon as we're done, you can head out. That conversation I've had plenty of times. Similarly, let's say Alice, you answered second. So let's say Alice is a database administrator in the organization. She's not on my team. Alice has her own Scrum team. But let's say I know for this sprint, we're going to be sending a lot of scripts to Alice to run in our environments. So we may approach Alice and say, hey, Alice, for this upcoming sprint, we're actually going to send you a lot of scripts to run in the database environments. Are you available to sit in sprint planning with us tomorrow? That way you can hear what these are going to be. You can help us ask some questions and get greater insights. We'll even try to do your stuff first. So as soon as your stuff is done, you can head out. So for number 6, if there are non-Scrum team members you want to invite that make the meeting better and more effective, I think that's great. I think you should do that. But what I don't love is I don't love people just being in there that don't really contribute and make the meeting slower and less effective. That I don't love in general for sprint planning because it's really more of a working level execution meeting. Awesome answer, folks. Anyone have any questions so far about sprint planning? Yeah. And Jim, I see your note here, cue the Scrum Master. Can you elaborate on that statement? I like the concept.
Yeah, just kind of relating to when you're inviting non-Scrum team members and you kind of want them to be there to add value, but not derail things. That's a perfect opportunity for your Scrum Master to step up and coach them on how not to derail a meeting and to kind of stop them from derailing the meeting and then coach them. So
excellent point. Yeah, that's a good point, Jim, is maybe pull them aside ahead of time, kind of have a little chat saying, hey, you just want to make sure kind of we don't derail a meeting. And then during the meeting, help facilitate it so that we don't get dragged into, off tangent and off course. Excellent point. Yeah. Good. Any other questions so far about sprint planning? All right. In the chat window, type in yes if you've ever been in a painful sprint planning meeting. I like Suleiman didn't have 1 yes, but 2 yes. I like Jim, you're shouting your yes. Yeah. All right. Anyone want to share why their sprint planning meeting was painful? Can I get a volunteer to share why their sprint planning meeting was painful?
Well, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, we can hear you.
So I've been struggling with one of my teams because our PO does not have user stories ready for the team to refine prior to planning. So planning ends up being like a refinement session planning. So it takes way longer than we should.
Yeah, that is a very good point. That's a very good point, Alice. Yep. Jim, I saw your hand up as well.
yeah, that's one of the things I coach my teams on is I guarantee you refinement can be a little bit painful, but it is going to pay dividends when it comes to planning. The the more painful your refinement is, the more time and focus you put into it, the less painful and the smoother your planning is.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. Awesome point, Jim. And I see Barbara, thank you for the note in the chat. Barbara says other devs won't speak up. That can be very painful as well, right? The general pattern we see as to why sprint planning is painful is we go to sprint planning and we spend an hour talking about this very first item. And then you realize, oh no, we legitimately have like 9 more of these to get through by the end of our sprint. And that's when we realize sprint planning is going to be painful, right? And the reason why it takes us an hour to get through this is because the product owner hasn't written any of these user stories out properly. There's no acceptance criteria. All 3 of these are just a big batch. None of it's prioritized. None of the developers have seen this yet, have no idea what any of this means. For these reasons, sprint planning can be very, very painful. So I'll give you some hints on how to kind of address that pain. Let's talk about refinement very quickly. Refinement is basically symbolized by this picture. Product backlog refinement is the act of adding new items as we learn about them. It's about removing things that are stale or dated. It's about reprioritizing based on latest learnings and needs. It's about splitting things up that are too big, paying particular attention that the items at the very top are ready for the team to consume. In theory, this should be happening organically throughout the sprint. But in practice, well, in theory, this should be happening organically throughout the sprint. So here's the example. Let's say that we're in the sprint. So what we have here is Thursday, April 2nd. I, the product owner, met with some stakeholders. I learned a few new user stories. I wrote them down, showed a few developers. That's refinement. Monday, April 6th, I, the product owner, met with my leadership team. We reprioritized a few things. That's refinement. Wednesday, April 8th, I, the product owner, met with my help desk group. They showed me some tickets that I added to the product backlog. I told the developers, gave them a quick heads up. Hey, there's a few new items in the product backlog. That's refinement. Wednesday, April 13th, I, the product owner, went to lunch with a couple of my stakeholders. I thought it was gonna be fun, casual lunch, but they wanted to talk about work the whole time, which was super annoying. But during that conversation, I learned 3 new user stories I wrote down. That's refinement. Tuesday, April 14th, we had a sprint review meeting. And during the sprint review meeting, I, the product owner, took a bunch of notes, which resulted in a few new user stories, as well as reprioritizing a few things. That's refinement. So refinement, in theory, happens organically throughout the sprint. It's not intended to be a set meeting by intent. But with that said, product owners notoriously struggle with this. So one technique I've seen teams use is setting aside time to do refinement. So in this example here, let's say we're doing sprint planning on Monday, April 15th. So a few days before then, let's say Thursday, April 9th, we'll set aside time to do refinement. So in this example here, what happens is it'll be the product owner, the Scrum Master coach and product are doing it, and you can have other team members in there as well doing refinement. And by doing refinement, what I mean is doing this kind of stuff right here, adding new items, removing things that are stale or dated, reprioritizing, paying particular attention that the items at the very top are ready for the team to consume. Right? Now, here is the trick. Here's the secret. Before this session is over, if you don't have developers already working with you, what you will do is bring in a minimum of at least 2 dev team members. You can bring in more. You can bring in as many as you want. You can bring the whole team if you want, but bring in at least two. So anywhere from 2 up to the whole team, bring them in. And what I would have them do is have them review the top items in the product backlog to make sure they're ready for the team to consume. So what I would do is have at least 2 developers look at these top items and give it a thumbs up if it's ready for the team to consume. That brings up this concept called definition of ready. Definition of ready is not an official Scrum concept, meaning your team doesn't have to do this, but I actually am a pretty big fan of it. I like definition of ready. Hold on one sec. Danny, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just wanted to bring your attention to a question in the chat in case
I saw the question. I'm going to hit that at the end of this module. Let me finish on this definition ready piece, and I'll hit that at the end of this module. Thank you.
Sounds good.
I do see your question, Heather. I'll hit that at the end of this module. Yeah. Oh, and then back to your question, Silman, is yes. So on the 9th, before this, my little refinement session's over, I'll bring in at least 2 developers. Bring in as many as you want, but bring in at least 2 to review these top items. And when they review it, I want them to give it a thumbs up if it's ready for the team to consume. Now, by giving it a thumbs up, it brings up a concept called definition of ready. Over the years, I've crafted my own version of definition of ready, which I'm going to share with you. You don't have to use this in your definition of ready, but this is a common source. And so you're free to use this. And so here's my definition of ready. Number one is, as a developer, first question I ask myself is, do we understand what's being asked of us from this PBI/user story? Number two is, do we understand the acceptance criteria? Number three is, do we understand why it's valuable? Number four is, do we know how to implement this? Number five is, are there dependencies that we really have to focus on to get to this? Number six is it right sized? By the way, anecdotally, what I've seen is one of the biggest problems plaguing Scrum teams is they can't finish all their work, not because they brought in too much work to the sprint, because the nature of their work was too big to finish. My recommendation, if your sprints are 2 or 3 weeks or longer, no single item should be more than about 4 or 5 days at most. And even here, I might even, I'd like to get an initial estimate, just to kind of get a rough idea of how big it is. That's number 6. And number 7 is, if my developers read a user story and they realize that they have a better, faster, more effective, more efficient, more preferred way of doing this, I don't want them to unilaterally change the user story without telling me, but I don't want them to keep it to themselves either. So if my teammates have a better idea to solve the same problem, I want to hear about it. And what I do as a product owner is I would go with the developer recommendation unless there's a business reason why I don't want to. My general rule of thumb is I go with the developer recommendation unless there's a business or product reason why I don't want to. Yeah. So if all 7 of these are good, we're ready to go on. But if any of these aren't good, then we want to have a deeper conversation to work through that. Yeah. By doing that, that helps ensure that when we get to sprint planning here, kind of like what Jim said earlier, by investing the time to do this and by ensuring that we kind of do a quick look through, this helps ensure that in sprint planning, it can be a very effective use of our time, where we can kind of really identify our strategy and goal and what we can fit into the sprint versus trying to figure out how to prioritize and what these user stories even mean. Yeah. Heather, I see your question. If things are refined ahead of time, why would sprint planning last more than 1 hour? I would propose this, Heather. The guidance is a maximum. So if you can do it effectively an hour, I think that's great. But with that said, there are a few things that kind of take it a bit longer. One is because no single item should be more than about 4 or 5 days. We do have a bit of volume to get through. So part of it's the volume. There sometimes are a bit more discussion in terms of maybe some of the tasking or trying to kind of align some of the estimates. So there could be a bit of that. But I would propose that if you can truly do it effectively within an hour, there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes just going through it and working through the conversation may take a bit more time. Yeah. Does that help with your question, Heather?
Yep, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions so far in regards to sprint planning? Let's look at the other end of this now, sprint review, right? And so now what you're looking at is the end of it. The sprint review meeting is a meeting we have at the end of the sprint that helps us identify, basically it's to inspect and adapt the product. So in sprint review, what we do in sprint review, it's where we invite everyone else. So in sprint review, we invite our users, our customers, our stakeholders, our subject matter experts, potentially members of leadership, potentially people from other teams. Basically in sprint review, you want to invite anyone and everyone you want to invite that you want to get feedback from. In sprint review, what we do ultimately is we really want to present the product increment. Ideally, we'd like to have our attendees play with the product increment. And really the goal is to get feedback to make sure what we built meets their user needs. Because if they love it, that's great to know, we can move on. If they don't love it, right, I can get the feedback earlier rather than later. The earlier I get feedback from my users, the more and better options I have to address their feedback. The later and later and later I wait to get my feedback, my options potentially get more expensive and they start closing down the later I get that feedback. That's why we do sprint review at the end of every sprint. The guidance here is 1 hour or less per week of sprint duration is the guidance. One quick note. Here's what I've seen before in sprint review. What I've seen is I've seen it be where the team comes in and says, all right, Here's our sprint review for this sprint. Our goal was 80 story points. Out of the 80 story points, we finished 60 of them. User story number 1, did we finish it? We did finish user story number 1. It's 13 pointer, good. User story number 2, did we finish it? We did not finish it. It was 8 story points. Here's why we didn't finish it. User story 3, did we finish it? Yes. 8 story points, good. User story 4, did we finish it? Yes. 5 story points, good. User story 5, do we finish it? No, why not? 8 story points. What are we gonna do about this? I've seen that in sprint review. Let me say this. That is not sprint review. That's some kind of project management checklist. I'm not saying if that's good or bad, but I am saying that is not sprint review. The intent of sprint review isn't to really necessarily track our progress. We will talk about that a bit, but the point of sprint review, it's really to inspect the product itself, right? And so in sprint review, we really want to focus on getting feedback on what we built rather than just saying what's done and not done. In fact, a lot of times in sprint review, I won't even talk about what we didn't do because we didn't do it. What I want to get focused on is based on what we did finish, what's the feedback on what we finished? Any questions so far about sprint review? Once again, I have some questions for the group. Question number 1, who was in the sprint review event? Type your answer in the chat. Who was in the sprint review event? Type your questions in the chat, or type your answers in the chat. Who's in this meeting? Good answers, right? So it is going to be the product owner, the Scrum Master, and developers. Think of it this way. The analogy I like to make is think that imagine we're having a dinner party. We're having a dinner party, right? So if I'm having a dinner party, the product owner, the Scrum Master, and developers, they would be the host of the dinner party. So the product owner, developer, Scrum Master, they're hosting the dinner party. They throw the sprint review. And then on top of that, it's anyone else we want to invite. Anyone else we want to invite, which includes stakeholders, users, customers, subject matter experts, potentially members of leadership, potentially people from other teams. It's anyone else we want to invite to our sprint review. Oh, once again, do I need all my developers there? Can some of them be there? Some of them doing other stuff? What do you folks think? Do I really need all my developers there? What do you folks think? Can I just have some there and others doing other things? Yeah, I agree with you, Didi. I would want everyone there. The reason why I want everyone there is I want everyone to hear the same messaging. I want everyone to see the same feedback. And I want and my developers there, they can potentially help answer questions that might come up during sprint review. Question number 2, when does the sprint review occur? When does the sprint review occur? Type your answer in the chat. When does sprint review happen? Type your answer in the chat. When does a sprint review occur? Well, this one looks like it's a little trickier. People are thinking about it. Let's see if we can get an answer in here. When does sprint review occur? Oh, good. So it is at the end of the sprint. And Barbara, I like your particular statement as well. It's at the end of the sprint before the retrospective. So sprint review happens at the end of the sprint, when the closing out events of the sprint, and before the retro. The reason it happens, very good answer, Barbara, and very good answer everyone, but Barbara in particular, with the before the retrospective. The reason why it happens before the retro is one of the data points you bring into the retrospective is the outputs and outcomes of the sprint review. One of the data points you bring into the retrospective is the output and outcomes of the sprint review. And so the sprint review does happen at the end of the sprint. And I do recommend, strongly recommend doing it before the retrospective. Good. Is the sprint review the first time the product owner has seen this updated product increment? Is the sprint review the first time the product owner has seen this updated product increment? In the chat window, type in what you think. Good answers, good answers, good answers. So Femi, Heather, Alice, great answers. Answer should be no, right? So here's why. Here's why. Imagine if I'm the product owner and I haven't seen any of this yet, we're in sprint review, right? And so we're in sprint review, and what I have is I have my stakeholders with me, my subject matter experts, a couple of the clients and users, and my leadership. And my team brings up the items from the sprint review, And I look up and I say, wait a minute, team, what is that? That is not what we agreed to. The team looks at me and says, Product Owner, that's exactly what we agreed to. That's exactly what user stories say. I say, team, it's not what user stories say. This doesn't even come close to matching some of the mockups. Team says, all right, first of all, we read the user stories exactly. And yeah, this matches the user stories and the colors might be different, but they match the mockups more or less the same. The moment we have this back and forth in front of our stakeholders, end users, customers, and leadership, what that does, it creates chaos and confusion, and it creates a loss of confidence in us as a team, right? If that conversation were to have happened, it should happen throughout the sprint, right? From a Scrum standpoint, what we recommend is the product owner should be reviewing these items real time so that by the end of the sprint, the product owner, developers, and Scrum Master are all on the same page. In fact, I recommend this. Before sprint review, I would have the product owner, Scrum Master, and developers have a quick sync up to make sure to kind of just really plan out the sprint review a little bit so that it can be very smooth, seamless experience for my end users, customers, and stakeholders for them to give their feedback. Next one. What is the purpose of sprint review? Why do we do it? Why do we do sprint review? Why do we do sprint review? In the chat window, type in what you think. Why do we do sprint review? What's the purpose? What's the goal of sprint review? Oh, this one looks like it's trickier. People are thinking about it. We will show the work developed during the sprint. That's good, yeah. Yeah. And ultimately, we want to show it's developed during the sprint. It's to review the increment. Good. That's good. That's good, Didi. Yeah, ultimately, it's to get feedback on the product increment itself, right? So make sure we're building the right thing. The sprint review is about inspecting and potentially adapting the product itself. The retrospective, remember, is about inspecting and adapting the process or how we work together. The sprint review is about being able to get feedback on what we built so far. It's about inspecting and adapting the product itself. Good answers. Number 5, I'm going to warn you right now, this one's almost impossible to get correct. So good luck. Who facilitates the sprint review? Who facilitates the sprint review? This one's almost impossible to get correct. Well, I guess unless you took my Scrum Master Product Owner course, then you might know it. It's not quite the product owner, not quite devs. And I'm going to admit right now, this is kind of a trick one. The reason why this is impossible, this is almost impossible to correct, is the correct answer is Scrum doesn't dictate who has to facilitate it. From a Scrum standpoint, it can be anyone. From a Scrum standpoint, we're agnostic. It can be the Scrum Master, like Jim points out. It could be the devs, like Alice points out. From a Scrum standpoint, it could even be the product owner, like Jerome points out. It could even be a third party if we wanted to. So Scrum doesn't dictate. However, I do have a recommendation. The way I like to do it is I like to do it so that the product owner kicks it off. Product owner says, welcome stakeholders to our sprint review. Our goal for this sprint was to create an e-commerce shopping cart for our e-commerce website. And to walk us through some of the core capabilities, I'm going to pass it off to my developer, Danny, to walk us through some initial features. And then I have the dev team members kind of walk through features and ideally have the team play with it. I will make a note about this as well. I actually do not want the product owner facilitating most of sprint review. Anyone have a guess as to why I don't want the product owner facilitating most of sprint review? See if anyone has a guess as to why we don't want the product owner facilitating most of sprint review. Well, here's why. So as a product owner, the purpose of sprint review is to get feedback from my end users and my customers, my stakeholders. And to do that, well, it's like my parents used to tell me. They'd say, son, you're either talking or you're listening, right? And so what happens is, if I'm facilitating a sprint review, what happens is, as a product owner, what I really want to do is I really want to soak in the information. I want to take notes and be able to really kind of soak in the feedback. That's very challenging to do if I'm facilitating. If you ever study classic facilitation, which, by the way, quick shout out, we do have a facilitation course. Danny is one of our trainers on that. Great course, Agile Facilitation. Quick shout out to Danny and his class. But if you look at classic facilitation, there's roles. There's a facilitator, participant, observer, and scribe are some of the classic roles in facilitation. So as a product owner, I don't mind kicking it off, but once we get into the actual feedback, as a product owner, I want to sit back and play more the observer and scribe role, where I really want to soak in the feedback, take my notes, help answer questions. And so I like having another team member facilitate. And as a product owner, I'll help answer questions, but I really want to be able to soak in the feedback and help answer questions. Oh, so the answer number 5 is Scrum doesn't dictate, but generally I like the product owner kicking it off, and I like having developers kind of facilitate most of it. Even the Scrum Master is great too, because the Scrum Master usually are very strong facilitators. Shout out to Danny. His next class is July 13th, 14th. Feel free to sign up. Danny can even give you discount codes if you want them. Send an email to Danny for the codes. Last question here. For a 2-week sprint, how long is your sprint review supposed to be? For a 2-week sprint, how long is your sprint review supposed to be? In the chat window, type in your answer for 2 weeks. Femi, you're close. You're thinking of the retrospective. That would indeed be the correct answer. 1.5 hours would be the correct answer for the retrospective. 2 hours is correct for sprint review. It's 1 hour or less per week of sprint duration. So for a 2-week sprint, what Femi, Alice, and Didi have here, no more than 2 hours. Awesome. All right. Well, in terms of my materials, that's what I have for sprint planning and sprint review. But what I want to do now is I want to open up the floor for any outstanding questions and comments. Questions or thoughts from the group? All right, if there's no questions or thoughts, let me just close out with a few closing notes. I'm going to once again give you my, Suleiman, I see your hand up. Question, Suleiman.
Yes, hi. So for the small or for the mini refinement meeting, would you do that, like the one you hold on the 9th with 2 developers? Would you make that like a regular small meeting?
Yeah.
Or you would make it case by case or when it's needed?
So great question, Suleiman. So what happens is, what I'm showing you here, here's the analogy I like to make, right? So refinement is not intended to be a set meeting. And so what we're doing here is the equivalent of training wheels. So remember when you were learning to ride a bicycle, most kids when they learn to ride a bicycle when they're little have like training wheels on the side to help them learn initially. Setting aside time to refinement would be like the equivalent of training wheels. So to answer your question, I would do that initially. If my product owner is really struggling with refinement, we do that to get them comfortable with it. But as they get more and more comfortable with it, then we would start moving away from kind of a set meeting into organically throughout the sprint. So to answer your question is, as your product owner gets more comfortable with it, initially I would probably do it a few days before every sprint planning meeting. But as a product owner gets more comfortable doing it organically throughout the sprint, maybe I move it away from a set meeting into more of an organic activity. Does that help answer the question?
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good question. Any other questions? All right. If not, you have my contact information in the screen. Feel free to join me on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. Feel free to join NextUp Solutions on both LinkedIn and Twitter as well. Come take our classes. If you need coaching, reach out to us. If you need software development, reach out to us as well. And other than that, I hope to see all of you again soon and enjoy the rest of your week. Thanks, everybody. Oh, hey, Danny, do you know if the presentation will be available somewhere?
Yes, this has been recorded, of course, and so all registrants will receive an email with a link to the video.
Okay, great. And I'll send you the soft copy of the slides as well in case anyone needs that as well.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Any other questions? All right. If not, I wish everyone a nice day, and I will hopefully get a chance to work with all of you at some point soon.